Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. That's in paragraph 2 of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. Still, I think, perhaps the most beautifully crafted, simple, and amazing presidential speech ever made. He's laying some blame there, but he's not going to gloat. It's March 1865. The war is almost over. The surrenders haven't occurred, but they're on the horizon. 1/8 of the whole population, said Lincoln, he went to the point. He didn't avoid it. 1/8 of the population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union. No kidding. But localized in the southern part. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. Wow. What an understatement. And then came this simple sentence. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. That's the most remarkable somehow in American rhetoric. Somehow, all knew. Well, all haven't always known since. But that speech went on. He said, most of us, all of us, hoped for a war, quote, less fundamental and astounding, his words, not as long, not as bloody, not as deadly, not as fundamental. But then he throws it over to God for a little while. The prayers of both could not be answered. He says we both prayed to the same God. But the prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Out in that outdoor audience on the back portico of the Capitol that day were all kinds of people. Frederick Douglass was about 11 or 12 rows into the audience down to Lincoln's left. We've now spotted him in a blow-up of a photograph. Douglass was there. And he will walk Pennsylvania Avenue behind the presidential carriage back to the White House. Douglass had dreamed of writing this speech for Lincoln, but said prayers of gratitude when he realized Lincoln wrote it. That was more important. He invokes the providence of God, which was so 19th century. But then he said that we fondly hope, as he famously expressed it, and fervently pray, that this mighty scourge of war will speedily pass away. But, or he used yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as it was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Every drop of blood shed by a lash shall be paid by blood shed by the sword. Slavery caused the war. Slavery must die in this war, and we must prosecute it to the ugliest end to end it. That's not the Abraham Lincoln of 1861. Sending an olive branch to the South. There are no olive branches, of course, left now. He did end with the famous last paragraph. That's what everybody loves to point to when they need a little Lincoln. when they need the Lincoln they want, when they need the Lincoln pure, they go to that last little paragraph, with malice toward none and charity for all. It's so poetic. Why not? Charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations. You can often see the second inaugural referred to only through the last paragraph, charity for all, without bothering to look at that long middle paragraph, which is retributive justice. Without that middle paragraph, that last part, Lincoln's last acts were many. He had said back in 1963 at Gettysburg that this war was a testing. Testing was his verb, a testing of whether any kind of republic like this could long endure. He had at least mouthed the word equality in that tight little short speech, though he had no idea where that idea was going. The Gettysburg Address is about the last best hope of Earth, a phrase he had actually used earlier in 1862. A republic, could it survive? And then by 1965, he's explaining in 3 paragraphs what the war meant. And within a month, of course, he was shot and murdered in Ford's Theater. As shocking an event as Americans had ever experienced. If you read Civil War diaries, you read diaries from the spring of 1965, all kinds of people would blacken the edges of their diary when they referred to the news of Lincoln's killing. Herman Melville wrote a poem about it. You knew I was going there. It's called The Martyr. He's trying to capture that moment. Good Friday was the day of the prodigy in crime, when they killed him in his pity, when they killed him in his prime. Of clemency and calm, when with yearning he was filled, to redeem the evil-willed, and though conqueror be kind, but they killed him in his kindness, in their madness and their blindness, and they killed him from behind. There's a sobbing in the land of the strong, and a pall upon the land, but the people in their weeping bear an iron hand. Beware the people weeping when they bear the iron hand. Would Reconstruction be the iron hand? Yes, for a while. I'm simplifying here, but that's what we do in this course. That's why I need Melville. He lieth in his blood, the Father in his face. They have killed him, the forgiver, the avenger take his place. The avenger wisely stern, who in righteousness shall do what the heavens call him to. And the parricides remand, for they killed him in his kindness, in their madness, and their blindness, and his blood is on their hand. There is sobbing of the strong, Melville ends, and a pall upon the land, for the people in their weeping bear the iron hand. Beware the people weeping when they bear the iron hand. If you get inside of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and its immediacy, its context, the war has it's not even fully ended yet, but the surrender at Appomattox had just occurred on the 12th of April. He's killed on the 14th, or shot on the 14th, dies on the 15th. The news has arrived. The most joyous public news in American history. Lee had surrendered to Grant at a little village called Appomattox. The details of the surrender weren't out yet, but they are going to be quite lenient. And within 48 hours comes the news. Lincoln's been shot in a theater. And there have been attempts on the lives of the vice president, the secretary of state, and 2 or 3 other cabinet members. William H. Seward, secretary of state, had been stabbed in his bed. It's pretty clear there was a conspiracy to wipe out the top of the federal government by John Wilkes Booth. People didn't know about Booth just yet. They will very soon. An attempt to decapitate, if you like, the government. It's going to make Andrew Johnson president of the United States overnight. There have been deaths of presidents, but never an assassination. We know a lot more about assassinations now in our history, unfortunately. They didn't. Martha Hodes wrote a great book, if you're looking for a book that gets you inside the Lincoln assassination, and especially the mourning, the short and longer term mourning, social mourning, public mourning, national mourning, and its meanings, not just for Lincoln, but for that war. It's got mourning in the title, and right now I'm forgetting the full title, but somebody will look it up for me and shout it out within 10 seconds, probably. Martha Hodes, brilliant book. The legacies of this war will go on arguably forever. They're still here. They're still around. They're probably visible on your bookshelves. They may be visible in some of your assumptions. They may be resonant in some of your thoughts, some of your beliefs, some of your worries, some of your attitudes about government, centralized government, the federal government, federalism, states' rights, race. Every time the United States has a racial reckoning, and count them, how many have we had? We reflect back to the first one, which was Reconstruction. The immediate aftermath, the emancipation of 4 million slaves. What do you do? Who are they? How would they be defined? How would the United States reinvent itself? Would it become a second founding of the United States? Yes. How long would it last? Reconstruction will tell. The legacies of the Civil War may still survive in unconscious ways in the way we mourn. To some extent, for a very long time, it had a tremendous effect on how people wrote. It brought a new so-called realism to writing, which would, in haphazard ways, take hold of American literature throughout the rest of the 19th century, with a few exceptions. But it would be fought against. It would be countered by a sentimentalism born by this war that became irresistible to Americans. How do you forget, or at least elide, the most horrific experiences you ever have? You find some alternative memory. We're all capable of that. We probably have all done it. You look for happy stories. You look for something more pleasing, more pleasant, more reconciling. And there was good old Walt Whitman. Whitman was trying so hard. He did it in his greatest poem, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. I'm not even going to read from it, but you should read it. It is Whitman's otherworldly meditation on the death of Lincoln and the funeral train, Lincoln's 22-day funeral train from Washington all over the country out to Springfield, Illinois. And he puts a bird, he calls it the warbling, a sparrow in a bush. And Whitman is sort of his own character in that songbird, he says, might, just might, with his songs, bring us somehow to reconcile. And he says, I walk toward the bush, and on one hand I have the horror and terror of this war. Death, he says. On the other hand, he has hope and reconciliation. And could that bird's songs make it happen? It's a kind of universal human prayer that there might be a way to get over this. He said in another poem that he literally entitled Reconciliation in 1865, one short verse. Word over all, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war, and all its deeds of courage must in time be utterly lost, that the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly, softly wash again and ever again this soiled world. For my enemy is dead. A man divine as myself is dead. That's a poem called Reconciliation. He's trying. He's trying. But America was in ruin. There were a lot of people out there now saying, the United States has finally grown up to be a real country. We're a real country now because we have ruins. All the great European civilizations, of course, had lots of ruins, and the greatest ruins in the world were in Greece and Rome. You want to see a real civilization, go to Rome and see the ruins. Forget about all that history that brought all the ruin. It's a photograph of Richmond, the end of the war. This is a photograph of... No, the other one was Charleston, sorry. This one's Richmond. 4 little black kids who have found themselves a Union kepi. It's an incredible photograph. They found themselves a Union cap, and they got their photos taken next to a column. What's ended? What's begun? I don't know. You can read into that photo a lot of things. We could give you that as a final exam question. Look at the photo. Discuss. You want that one? Visual learner right there wants that one. Yes, okay. But then there was this guy. William Tecumseh Sherman wasn't ready to reconcile with anybody, never was. He certainly wasn't going to reconcile with all the enslaved people that followed his army from Atlanta to the sea. He didn't want them there, but they were. Hundreds at first and thousands of them. There were no black soldiers in Billy Sherman's army. He didn't allow it. Even though the law said he had to. Sherman wouldn't have fought this war to end slavery, but he knew he was doing that, and he didn't particularly like it. That's why you got to read, students, that colloquy between the 20 black ministers led by their selected leader, Reverend Frazier, face to face with William Tecumseh Sherman in an old, beautiful house in Savannah. Once Sherman's army reached Savannah, they sit down and discuss the meaning of the war. That's up on the canvas. Read that exchange. Sherman left before the 20th question was even asked. He couldn't take it anymore. But Sherman had an attitude that a hell of a lot of Americans did about this war at this point. And it has easily as much to do with what's going to happen in Reconstruction as did Lincoln's kindness or leniency or grace in that second inaugural. Here's Sherman. As for changing the opinions of the people of the South, that is impossible, and they must be killed or dispossessed. We must colonize and settle as we go south. Enemies must be killed or transported to some other country. Now, if we heard a leader say that today, we'd say, well, this is a recipe for ethnic cleansing or terror. And that's, in part, what Sherman's March to the Sea was. Sherman was constantly appealed to by white Southerners, especially by women. Please, sir, have some mercy. He answered a Miss P.A. Fraser, who wrote to him in Georgia, complaining that the Yankees were tearing everything down. They were burning everything after they stole the hogs and the hay and the whatever they could steal. And he wrote back to her and he said, "Would to God ladies acted their mission on earth, that instead of inflaming the minds of their husbands and brothers to lift their hands against the government of their birth and stain them in blood, had prayed to forbear, to exhaust all the remedies afforded by our glorious Constitution, and thereby avoided horrid war, the last remedy on earth. Too bad, lady, is what Sherman's saying. Pay the price." Now, that's not the stuff of reconciliation, you can be sure. And the men, the so-called radical Republicans, who are going to devise Reconstruction, are fully aware of that, and some of them are full of their own retribution. You've all probably heard, that everyone was waving bloody shirts at the time of boy, these hombres are always worth looking at. This is a photograph taken of 3 Confederate prisoners at Gettysburg after the battle. The deepest legacies of the Civil War, of course, as I've already implied, were in the lives lost, the lives ruined, the lives and psyches damaged by massive war, by over and over, month after month, engaging in this kind of war. We didn't have any terminology for post-traumatic stress in the 19th century. They had a phrase they sometimes used called shook over hell. Oh, that guy must have been shook over hell because he was not right, or he was suicidal. Waves of suicides by veterans in the wake of the Civil War. There's a whole new little kind of corner of scholarship on that now. Want to join the field? Of course, photographers did this over and over and over. These are some of the dead at Spotsylvania Courthouse in Virginia in 1864, lined up, ready for the gravediggers. And Winslow Homer, our great landscape, seascapes, landscapes, a great 19th century painter, went south. He went to Petersburg. He saw the trenches around Petersburg, which were there for 10, 11 months. He saw the troops. He left us. I don't want to show you any more than one of these because I could talk about nothing else but Winslow Homer the rest of the day. But this is Winslow Homer's painting. He called it Defiance, inviting a shot. These guys lived in these trenches for months and months and months, sometimes only a couple hundred yards apart. And this guy, according to Homer at least, has got up on the top of one day and said, "Hey, MF, shoot me. Come on." Don't know if he got shot or not. Soldiers went crazy. Somebody now, though, had that's Walt on the right. He snuck into the photograph of Andrew Johnson here. I don't know how that happened. But this is the man who, of course, replaces Abraham Lincoln. Why was he on the ballot? Good question. It's kind of a little blemish in Lincoln's star. Gee, Abe, why'd you put old Andrew Johnson on the ballot with you as your running mate in 1864 and get rid of Hannibal Hamlin? It's because Hannibal Hamlin of New Hampshire wasn't any good to him anymore. Andrew Johnson seemed politically very useful. He was the only senator from a seceded state. His state was Tennessee. The only senator from a seceded state who did not secede, who did not leave his seat. He stayed in the U.S. Senate. Eventually, Lincoln appointed him the wartime governor of Tennessee. More on that in a second, when Lincoln sets up these fledgling little governments. Andrew Johnson was, well, he was many things. He was an East Tennessee stump speaker. He was an old Jacksonian Democrat. He believed firmly in states' rights, firmly in the Union, and firmly in slavery. The two Andys would have gotten along very well, Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. To call Andy Johnson racist to his bones is not even getting there. But he was a staunch Unionist. And he would not. He thought secession was a terrible mistake by the Southern states, and he said so, and he stayed in the Union. His slogan for Reconstruction, even before the war was over, was the Union as it was and the Constitution as it is. Put the Union back together as fast as possible, but don't change the Constitution. No civil rights, no voting rights, no rights for black people, no racial equality in America. Yes, slavery's ended, slavery's over. He wasn't thrilled by that, but he knew that was a fact. But this experimentation with racial equality, he'd have nothing to do with it. Back up with me, though. In the middle of the war, you'll note that on the outline I had a category for wartime reconstruction. A lot goes on between 1863 and 65 explicitly about the idea of Reconstruction within Washington, and certainly in newspaper editors' offices all over the North. If indeed the North wins this war, what would malice toward none and charity for all mean to Abraham Lincoln? Well, he'd already worked this up. I'm going to go quick with this. Lincoln put together, as early as 63, what he called a 10% plan. That meant that, first of all, it reflects Lincoln's constitutional views. Lincoln believed that secession had not really happened because it's illegal. They couldn't secede, so they're still sort of in the Union. Yeah, they've lost 650,000 to 700,000 men in this god-awful war, but the Southern states didn't really leave legally. So his goal here all along had been to squash the rebellion, force the Confederacy into defeat and surrender. And part of that forcing of them was emancipation, an enveloping, rolling process of destroying the South's labor system, economy, and future. Lincoln would have kind of preferred more of a restoration or reunification. He was a gradualist by instinct. You know that from whatever I said a week ago about his pre-war views. He wanted this process under executive authority. He didn't want the radicals in his own party to get hold of this process. He didn't want Congress to get the power over this process because he knew it would be much harsher and much longer. Got that right, Abe? He wanted a rapid, lenient, and moderate reconstruction so as, in his view, this is Lincoln, to avoid further civil war. The harsher the Reconstruction process might be to Lincoln, this is well before the war was even over, he believed would just mean the war would never end. Bands of Confederate troops, bands of rebels would be roaming around the South and still making war in the United States. He wanted a clean ending to this war so that it would not end like many civil wars in history have. They never quite end. The rebels go to the hills or the sea, and their sons come back. That kind of is going to happen to the United States in a different way. It's called the lost cause. Lincoln put out a plan. The end of 1863, it was called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. He would pardon all ex-Confederates, he said, with serious exceptions. High-ranking military officers, although he left that a little loose about how high-ranking. Those who had resigned their commissions or their judicial and congressional positions to aid the rebellion. Now, that meant anybody who had resigned from Congress, resigned from a federal judgeship. It meant Andrew Johnson he wouldn't have to be pardoned because he didn't leave, but he's the only one. That's why he's on the ballot. He had a vague category, too, here that he was not going to pardon anybody who had, quote, mistreated black soldiers. Now, how that was going to be proved exactly never was stated or determined. And then he simply said, when 10% of the voting population of a given state, and that voting population would be deemed as of the 1860 election, if X 100,000 people, men, voted in Alabama in 1860, when 10% of that number had taken an oath back to the United States, established a government, they would be recognized and returned to the Union by the president. He's going to establish new governments of a sort for a little while in 3 states, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Fledgling, to say the least. They were pitifully weak. They were totally dependent on federal troops in the parts of their states that were occupied. But his fellow Republicans in Congress are up in arms over this. In early 1864, that same winter of 1864, with the impending presidential election of 1864 ahead of them, some of his fellow Republicans are going to lead an effort to dump Lincoln from the ticket because he's just gone lenient. He's gone soft on the Confederacy, they say. And they want to replace him with John C. Fremont, who had been their candidate and their standard bearer back in 1856, who was still, though he was a dandy and a playboy and not always trustworthy, he was deemed more abolitionist, more left, we would say, than Abe Lincoln. But mostly they were just angry at the show of grace toward the South. And the response was led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Stevens is on your upper right. He almost fits in that category of John C. Calhoun as the sternest-looking SOBs in the mid-19th century American politics. Thaddeus Stevens was one tough character. He was brilliant. He was unrelenting. And he was a radical abolitionist from Pennsylvania. Charles Sumner at the lower right was a very different kind of personality. He was to a bit of a silver spoon born in Beacon Hill in Massachusetts, Harvard boy. But he too became, without question, a radical abolitionist. He gave long speeches in the Senate when they finally let him speak, laced with Latin and Greek quotations, just to show off. He knew that most of his colleagues didn't have a clue what he was saying. You know, people just do. Some people go into French once in a while just to show you. You know, I'm fluent in French. Fine, but what did you say? You know, nothing against French. I wish I had learned it better. Anyway, Stevens and Sumner had an answer for this, and they start their process of trying to take hold of Reconstruction policy during the war years and then especially after. Thaddeus Stevens said, no, none of this 10%. In fact, he called the idea of only 10% of a southern state taking an oath and all. He said that, quote, is a mere mockery of democracy. And Stevens said they should be treated, the ex-Confederate states, as, quote, conquered provinces. It's a phrase worth remembering because it kind of explains things. They should be treated as foreign, conquered provinces in a foreign war. And under the Constitution, that's pretty clear. You conquer someone else's territory, well, there's going to have to be a treaty. And treaties are approved by what? The U.S. Senate. Not by presidents. And Stevens claimed he was using the principles of international law, and he was to a great extent. Charles Sumner came up with an even more kind of overt phrase. He said the Confederate States had committed state suicide. That's pretty clear. They'd killed themselves as states. Done. Gone. They got to be recreated. Who creates new states under the U.S. Constitution? The Congress. Who admits them to the Union? The Congress. This is a battle royale now developing, even in the war years, politically, as they're trying to win the war. Sumner said, no, those 11 seceded states have to be returned to the status of unorganized territories. They have to be reinvented again. They're going to be reinvented by the Congress, especially a Republican-controlled Congress. And to Stevens and Sumner and their many friends now, Charles Sumner hadn't always had many friends, they see Reconstruction as a period of experimentation. To go back to Joanne's idea of the whole era of the American Revolution, those guys were experimenting. Well, so were our second founders. The second founders were experimenting, and they wanted more time to do it. They wanted Reconstruction to be slower, much more harsh, and radical. They passed what they called the Wade-Davis Bill. It's up on the outline. It was named for Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Henry Winter Davis of Maryland, two Republicans. Yes, there were Republicans even in Maryland. They answer Lincoln's 10% idea, and they say, no. They wanted a majority of white male citizens of any ex-Confederate state. Though that majority, every one of them, had to take what was known as the ironclad oath, claiming they had never aided and abetted the war effort by the Confederate States of America. Now, already you're thinking, there is no majority in Georgia of white men who never aided and abetted the Confederate war effort. That's the point. By making the entry fee the ironclad oath, you're making sure this is going to take a long time. It could be altered at some point, of course. An oath is an oath until it's a different oath. Thirdly, they said all officers above lieutenant, which is just about everybody, and all civil officials in the Confederacy, federal and state, would be disfranchised forever. The leadership class of the South would be eliminated from their polity. And they would be explicitly declared in that elimination, quote, not a citizen of the United States. It was almost like an invitation to go into exile. Just leave. Go to Brazil. Go to England. Go wherever the hell you want, but leave. Now, they may bend on that, well, they will bend on that one. They were treating the Confederates as conquered enemies in their language, in their proposals. What did Lincoln do with that bill once passed? He gave it a pocket veto. You know what that is. You just don't react to it. You put it in the drawer. Pocket veto. Then eventually he issued what he called his proclamation on the Wade-Davis bill. That was in July 1964. This is when he's under such pressure, not even knowing if his own party is going to support him for president, but he's taking on his own party now, and he tried so hard to be conciliatory to them. He had good relationships with Sumner and some of the other. He didn't have a good relationship with Stevens. And then he said to them, I do not completely reject any proposal. Okay. What the hell does that mean? I do not completely reject any proposal. Thank you very much. Meeting is over. He's trying to placate the radicals at the same time. He's trying to keep hold of Reconstruction planning and keep hold of winning the war, and if possible, keep hold of winning re-election. If there's any point in the war where Lincoln would have just gone off and walked into the Potomac and said, I've had it, that would have been it. But he couldn't. So here are the divided sides. A slow, harsh Reconstruction led by Congress, a much quicker, more lenient Reconstruction led by the president. After the fall of Atlanta, after Sheridan's marches down through the Shenandoah Valley, after fall of Mobile Bay, after Lincoln gets reelected in the fall of '64, so much changed, not least of which was that the Congress in early '65, January of '65, created something called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was its formal title. The United States have never had an agency anything like this before. It was a huge government social welfare program trying to answer the needs of refugee freed people and refugee white people all across the South as the war was winding down and coming to some visible end somewhere. It actually didn't pass Congress till the first week of March, right before Lincoln's second inauguration. It had many basic purposes. It's only going to last 4 years. This government agency to give the wherewithal of survival to human beings on both sides in the South. Never been done before by the federal government, and went against so many people's visions of federalism. Federal government shouldn't be doing this. But nobody else can. It was a USAID program for the white refugees and black refugees from total war. And they will do amazing things. More on that we move ahead to the late 1860s next time. They will create schools. They will give out millions of rations of food. They'll create hospitals. They'll settle some 30,000 displaced people on new land. They'll negotiate the first ever contracts between freed people and their former owners, which were not easy to do, but they did it. In its entire existence of 4 years, the Freedmen's Bureau spent $5 million on education for the freed people. The Civil War itself was costing $2 million a day by 64, 65. Freedmen's Bureau never had enough budget to do much of anything, but what it did with what it had is remarkable. And it left an extraordinary legacy there as well. Now, the 13th Amendment also passed a month and a half before that. It's the 13th Amendment. The amendment, the simplest of the amendments, that ended slavery forever. Or we can always hope. It has 2 simple sentences. Look it up. It ended involuntary servitude of any kind forever except for imprisonment for crime. Now, there's a whole lot of advocates of working against the incarceration crisis in America, and they are working against that for very good reasons, but a whole lot of blame has been thrust on the 13th Amendment because of that phrase, except for imprisonment for crime. it's, in my humble view, always been wrong-headed to blame the 13th Amendment for our incarceration program, would stem from those ridiculous drug laws of the 1970s and 1980s, and you want to blame the 13th Amendment? Way too easy. That got into the Constitution because it gave validity to the Emancipation Proclamation legally. It removed all legal doubt and freed the slaves everywhere, not just in the states in rebellion, not just in sections of the South. It freed the slaves everywhere. The passage of the 13th Amendment, how many of you have seen the movie Lincoln? Yeah. Not as many in the upper deck. That's all about the 13th Amendment. Steven Spielberg originally was going to make a film, an epic, about the whole Lincoln presidency, all 4 years of it. And then once they got going into it, they realized, no, that's way too big. And Liam Neeson quit on them, and happily they got Daniel Day-Lewis, greatest actor on planet Earth. And they made it about the passage of the 13th Amendment. About 1 month in Lincoln's presidency. Oh, what a day it was when it narrowly passed in the Congress. One of Douglas's sons, Charles, was in the gallery in the House of Representatives when it passed that day, and all the screaming and cheering and hugging on one side and all the shouting and ugly epithets on the other were happening. And he wrote a quick note to his father that said, "Father, this is your day. You should be here. Why aren't you here?" He couldn't be everywhere, for God's sake. Yeah. All right. And all along, waiting in the wings, and he wasn't really even waiting in the wings. This is John Bingham. He was he was the chairman of the tribunal that tried John Wilkes Booth. Well, no, Booth was shot. Tried the other members of John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy in the murder of Lincoln and the attempted murder of others. John Bingham was an evangelical Christian radical abolitionist from mid-central Ohio. He'd been in Congress now for quite a while. He was very well respected as not only a congressional tactician, but a serious and aggressive abolitionist thinker within the law. And Bingham led the effort by early 1866 in those astonishing debates in the U.S. Congress over a 14th Amendment. They needed another amendment. They needed another set of laws of some kind. Yes, they're going to be free. We're freeing all the slaves. But who are they? What are they? And Bingham, he wasn't alone in this at all. Bingham says over and over on the floor of the House, we need to federalize the Bill of Rights. We need to establish equality before law. We need to establish birthright citizenship. I'll come back to that slide, even though you can't read it. This is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. It's ratified in 1868, but it passed in June 1866 after knockdown, drag-out debates in the Congress. This is the second founding of the United States. And no one has to apologize for using that term or that phrase anymore. It's in the titles of many books, including one by Eric Foner. What holds you together as American citizens, what holds this society together, if you can keep it, is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. If my microphone works over here, what did it mean to federalize the Bill of Rights? Well, Bill of Rights has all sorts of rights in it. But Americans had always lived under this system of federalism, which says you can only really enforce these things at the state level. Bingham says, nope. We fought and bled in this war. We sacrificed so much in this war. Now, it must be enforced by the federal government. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Sentence 1. Birthright citizenship, now under attack, has been under attack by, let's be honest, Republicans for years. If you can eliminate that first sentence of the 14th Amendment, you got a whole new legal lever to get immigrants out of this country. There is nothing more sacred in the U.S. Constitution than Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, except possibly Sentence 2 of the 14th Amendment. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. Who's a citizen? Everyone born here. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. How often have you heard those two words in our recent immigration debates? Of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The Equal Protection Clause, equality before law, is probably the source or the cause or the subject of about 2/3 of all litigation in American courtrooms every day and as we speak. What does equal protection mean? It's been interpreted 1,000 different ways. It's been interpreted in favor of affirmative action and against affirmative action. It's been interpreted in favor of toleration and against toleration. It's been interpreted for racist purposes and anti-racist purposes. It's been interpreted to support gay and LGBT rights and to denounce them. I could go on and on with that list. These are just words. But the umbrella that is hovering above you as American citizens is John Bingham's Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And the fellow should have a stamp, a U.S. stamp. You know what that is. Long been an effort to get John Bingham on a stamp. But nobody knows anything about him. We're trying to remedy that. All right, I'll leave you here. That same winter, 1866, in February, Frederick Douglass gets together 12 black men. Actually, one white guy was with him. One of his sons was with him, Lewis. They got an appointment at the White House to meet with Andrew Johnson. They knew that Johnson didn't want to meet with them. They knew it wasn't going to be happy and pleasant, but they wanted to go to the president and demand the rights, civil and political, for black people before Congress finally decided whatever they were going to do. They sat down for a full hour with the president, and he barely would let them speak. Johnson gave them a speech. He said, you know, back in Tennessee, I used to own slaves, but I freed mine. What are you supposed to do with that? Oh, thank you, sir. You know, now that the slaves are freed, the real inequality is for white people. Where have you heard that? He did, right to their faces. Douglass kept trying to interrupt. Mr. President, may we ask? No, you may not. For 45 minutes, he lectured them about how there will never be racial equality in the United States, because if there is, it'll lead to intermarriage, it'll lead to race riots, and they ought to be happy that they're at least free. And as they were leaving the room, I've left out a lot here, Douglass finally said to his delegation, we're done here. And they're walking out, and everybody in the room could hear Andrew Johnson say, that Douglass, he's just like every other N-word in the world. He'll slit your throat when you turn your back. I don't know what Douglass did in that moment. I've always imagined he must have turned around and looked in Johnson's eye that look. But then he went back to a hotel office where he and his group gathered, and Douglas wrote a new speech. That's what he did. He went to his desk to know what he thought. And he wrote a speech about the crisis of the land, the problems before the country, in the midst of this debate over the 14th Amendment. And before he ends the speech, and he kind of lost it. He advocated a constitutional amendment to eliminate the vice presidency. Fred. And a couple other weird constitutional amendments. Fred lost it there. But before he ended the speech, he said, you know, our Constitution is pretty good. It's all well and good when a good man is serving in the presidency. But you missed the punchline. We have to have a Constitution that serves us when a bad man is in the presidency. I didn't say that. Frederick Douglass did. Thank you. Have a good autumn break. See you next time.